an original story narrated exclusively for love written in silence. Lady Millicent Lockwood's fingers trembled as she adjusted her modest widow's cap in the mirror, the Duke of Thornfield's words from the ball still echoing through her mind. "You look like someone I loved once." The candlelight caught in her eyes as she removed the sapphire pendant hidden beneath her high collar. The one possession she had kept from her former life. Outside her window, frost covered the formal gardens of Ravenscroft Hall, the winter air as still and fragile as the silence she had maintained for 7 long years. She could see him from her window now, walking alone through the maze, his shoulders bearing the weight of a dukedom and a political marriage that would secure his position. Millicent turned away, her reflection showing the face of a woman who had once been a duchess, now choosing anonymity over truth, preservation over desire. The morning light filtered reluctantly through the frost-laced windows of Ravenscroft Hall, casting long shadows across the library, where Lady Millicent Lockwood sat cataloguing the family collection. Her widow's cap and severe gray dress marked her as clearly as a uniform might, a woman of good birth fallen on reduced circumstances, now serving as companion to the elderly Countess of Ravenscroft. "Another letter from London, Lady Millicent," said Mrs. Winters, the housekeeper, placing a sealed note beside the ledger. "The Countess asks that you review it before her afternoon tea." Millicent nodded with quiet dignity. "Thank you. I shall attend to it directly." 7 years of practiced composure had perfected her ability to move through the world without drawing notice. At 32, she was neither young enough to attract suitors nor old enough to command authority. The perfect age for invisibility, she often thought, precisely as she had intended. She broke the seal and unfolded the letter, her eyes scanning the elegant script. The Countess's nephew, the Duke of Thornfield, was returning to society after years abroad, serving the Crown's interests in the aftermath of Napoleon's defeat. More significantly, he was to announce his engagement to Lady Caroline Harcourt, daughter of the influential Earl of Westmoreland, a political match that would cement alliances necessary in these uncertain times. The Duke would be arriving at Ravenscroft Hall within the week. The Countess was hosting a winter ball in his honor. Millicent's hand stilled. The room suddenly felt colder than the January air outside. "Is something amiss with the correspondence?" Mrs. Winters asked, noticing her hesitation. Millicent replied, her voice steady despite the sudden hammering of her heart. "Merely the usual social obligations. Please inform the Countess. I shall join her shortly." When the housekeeper departed, Millicent moved to the window, pressing her palm against the cold glass. Outside, England of 1817 continued its careful reconstruction. The war was over, but its shadows lingered in empty chairs at dinner tables, in widows' weeds, in the precarious balance of power among those who had survived. She had not seen the Duke of Thornfield in 7 years, not since she had walked away from her life as. No. She would not allow herself to complete that thought. That woman was dead, as far as society knew. A tragic accident during the tumultuous war years. A body never recovered. A convenient end to what might have become a devastating scandal. Lady Millicent. The Countess's voice came from the doorway, startling her from her reverie. Lady Ravenscroft, still elegant at 73, leaned heavily on her cane. "You've read about my nephew's return, I presume?" "Yes, my lady. A momentous occasion, indeed. Alexander has been too long absent from proper society. This match with the Harcourt girl will settle him at last." The Countess lowered herself carefully into a chair. "You will help me prepare for the ball, of course." It was not a question. "Naturally," Millicent replied. "Though I wonder if my presence at the ball itself would be appropriate, as your companion. I could better serve by ensuring the household arrangements." "Nonsense," the Countess interrupted. "You are of good family, despite your circumstances. Your presence lends respectability. Besides," she added with a shrewd glance, "you are too young to hide yourself away entirely. If only you knew," Millicent thought, "how deliberately I have hidden." "As you wish, my lady." That evening, alone in her modest chamber, Millicent opened the small wooden box she kept locked in her desk drawer. Inside lay a sapphire pendant on a thin gold chain, the only possession she had kept from her former life. She did not put it on, merely touched it briefly before closing the box again. The Duke of Thornfield had changed during his years abroad. Reports described him as more reserved, more focused on duty than the man she had known. War and responsibility had shaped him, as they had shaped her. They were different people now. He would not recognize her. How could he? The woman he had known had been vibrant, confident, moving through society with ease. Lady Millicent Lockwood, with her downcast eyes and quiet demeanor, was a shadow of that person. Her hair now pulled severely back, her figure concealed by modest dresses, her voice rarely raised above a murmur. She had constructed this identity carefully after the accident that had nearly exposed everything. A distant connection to a minor noble family, a tragic early widowhood, a respectable poverty that necessitated employment as a companion. No one questioned such a common story. For 7 years, it had been enough. She had found a kind of peace in anonymity, in the quiet work of managing the Countess's correspondence and household affairs. She had almost convinced herself that the past was truly buried, but now Alexander was returning, and with him all the dangers she had fled. The following days passed in a flurry of preparations. Millicent threw herself into the work, overseeing the cleaning of the grand ballroom, reviewing menus, directing the placement of winter greenery and candles. If she worked until exhaustion each night, she might not lie awake thinking of what was to come. The night before the Duke's arrival, snow began to fall, silent and relentless, blanketing the estate in white. Millicent stood at her window watching the transformation, wondering if it might provide an excuse to remain secluded during his visit. But as dawn broke on the day of his arrival, the skies cleared to a perfect, brittle blue. The world outside sparkled like cut crystal, beautiful and unforgiving. There would be no reprieve. The past, like winter, had returned to Ravenscroft Hall. The winter ball transformed Ravenscroft Hall into a glittering sanctuary against the bitter cold. Crystal chandeliers cast their glow over elegant couples, while evergreen boughs and white roses perfumed the air. Millicent had positioned herself strategically in a corner of the ballroom, half hidden behind a marble column. From here, she could fulfill her duties to the Countess, while remaining largely unobserved. The Duke of Thornfield had arrived that afternoon, but Millicent had managed to avoid the formal welcome. Now, however, avoidance was impossible. He stood at the entrance to the ballroom, commanding attention without effort. 7 years had indeed changed him. The handsome young nobleman, she remembered, had matured into a man of formidable presence. His dark hair was now threaded with silver at the temples, and fine lines marked the corners of his eyes. His posture was military straight, his expression composed but distant as he greeted the assembled guests. Lady Caroline Harcourt stood beside him, fair and poised, the perfect political partner. Millicent observed their interaction carefully. There was respect between them, courtesy, but no warmth that she could discern. "Lady Millicent, there you are." The Countess appeared at her side. "Come, I must present you to my nephew. You will be working closely with him on the estate ledgers during his stay." Panic flared in Millicent's chest. "My lady, surely the Duke has more pressing matters." "Alexander has always had a head for figures," the Countess said firmly, "and you have done wonders organizing our accounts." "No, it's decided. Come." There was no escape. Millicent followed the Countess across the ballroom, keeping her eyes lowered, her steps measured. Perhaps if she spoke little and excused herself quickly. "Alexander, may I present Lady Millicent Lockwood, my companion these past 5 years. She has quite transformed our household management." The Duke turned from his conversation, and Millicent executed a perfect curtsy, still not meeting his gaze. "Lady Millicent," he said, his voice deeper than she remembered. "My aunt speaks highly of your organizational skills." "Your Grace is too kind," she murmured. "I merely provide what assistance I can." "Lady Millicent is excessively modest," the Countess said. "She has education far beyond most women of her station. Quite the scholar, in fact." Millicent finally raised her eyes, prepared to offer a self-deprecating remark, and found the Duke studying her with an odd intensity. "Have we met before, Lady Millicent?" he asked, his brow furrowing slightly. "I don't believe so, Your Grace." The lie came easily after years of practice. have lived quietly since my husband's passing." Something flickered in his expression. Not recognition, but a shadow of it. Confusion, perhaps. "My condolences on your loss." "It was many years ago," she replied, already beginning to step back. "If you'll excuse me, I should ensure the refreshments are—" "Actually," the Duke said, "I believe the next dance is beginning." "Would you do me the honor, Lady Millicent?" The request silenced the nearby conversations. The Duke of Thornfield, dancing with a paid companion. Millicent saw Lady Caroline's perfectly arched eyebrow rise a fraction. "Your Grace, I rarely dance," Millicent protested softly. "Then we shall both be somewhat out of practice," he replied with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I insist." The Countess nodded approvingly. "Go on, Millicent. One cannot refuse a duke." The musician struck up a waltz. Millicent had no choice but to place her gloved hand in his and allow him to lead her onto the floor. His touch was formal, proper, and yet she felt it like a brand through the thin fabric of her glove. They began to move with the music, maintaining a respectable distance. Millicent kept her gaze fixed somewhere near his shoulder, acutely aware of the curious glances directed their way. "You manage my aunt's correspondence as well, I understand," the Duke said conversationally. "Yes, Your Grace." "Then you are familiar with her rather creative spelling. A family trait, I'm afraid." Despite herself, Millicent's lips curved slightly. "The Countess has a unique approach to written language. That's a diplomatic way of putting it." A pause. "You smile as though you've heard this observation before." Millicent stiffened. "It is merely an obvious conclusion for anyone who reads her letters." The waltz continued, and with it their careful conversation. Millicent answered his questions with polite brevity, volunteering nothing. Yet with each turn around the floor, the Duke's expression grew more perplexed, as though trying to place a half-remembered melody. Then, as they turned near the tall windows overlooking the snow-covered gardens, he suddenly faltered in his steps. His hand tightened almost imperceptibly on hers. "Lady Millicent," he said, his voice lowered so that only she could hear. "Forgive me, but I must ask." He stopped, studying her face in the candlelight. Then, with a gentleness that threatened to undo all her careful composure, he lifted his hand to tilt her chin upward, bringing her eyes fully to his. "You look like someone I loved once," he whispered. The world seemed to stop. For a terrible moment, Millicent thought she might faint, but years of self-discipline held firm. "Many people bear passing resemblances to others, Your Grace," she managed to say, her voice steady despite the thundering of her heart. "I have a common sort of face." "No," he said slowly, "you do not." The music drew to a close. Millicent stepped back and curtsied deeply, using the moment to compose herself. "Thank you for the dance, Your Grace," she said, already retreating. "I must return to my duties." She walked away with measured steps, feeling his gaze following her. Only when she reached the relative safety of the refreshment room did she allow herself a moment of weakness, pressing her hand against the wall to steady herself. He didn't recognize her. Not truly. He had seen a ghost, a resemblance, nothing more. The woman he had loved was dead, as far as he knew. Lady Millicent Lockwood was merely a shadow that had briefly stirred his memory. She would be more careful now, limit their interactions, speak even less. In a week, he would return to London with his political bride, and the danger would pass. But as she rejoined the ball, moving quietly among the guests, she caught his eye across the room. He was watching her with the expression of a man presented with a puzzle he could not quite solve. The night stretched before her, endless and treacherous as the winter beyond the windows. 3 days after the ball, Millicent sat in the estate office, reviewing the quarterly accounts when the door opened. She knew without looking up that it was the Duke. His presence seemed to alter the very air in the room. "Lady Millicent," he said, closing the door behind him. "My aunt. You can help me understand the changes to the tenant arrangements since my last visit." She kept her eyes on the ledger. "Of course, Your Grace. The Countess has implemented several new systems." He took the chair opposite her desk, rather than the master's seat at the larger table, a choice that put them on more equal footing. It was the sort of subtle consideration that she remembered from before. "You've organized everything quite differently than my steward in London," he observed. studying the open books. "I find this method more efficient for tracking individual family circumstances," she explained, turning the ledger toward him. "Each tenant has unique needs that affect their ability to meet their obligations." The Duke leaned forward, his finger tracing a notation beside the name, Thompson. "You've reduced their rent." "Temporarily. Mrs. Thompson is with child, and her husband was injured during the harvest. They have always been reliable, so I advised the Countess to show leniency until spring." He studied her with that same perplexed expression from the ball. "Many would consider that poor business practice." "Perhaps," she replied, meeting his gaze briefly. "But I believe true economy lies in preserving good tenants through difficult times, rather than replacing them when they fail." Something shifted in his expression. "That is precisely what I told my steward last month, regarding a similar situation at Thornfield Park." Millicent looked away, realizing her mistake. It was a philosophy they had once discussed at length, in another life. "It is merely common sense, Your Grace." "Common sense is remarkably uncommon in my experience," he said quietly. They worked together for the next hour, reviewing the estate's finances. Despite her caution, Millicent found herself drawn into genuine discussion. The Duke asked intelligent questions and listened to her explanations with respect. It was dangerous territory. This easy intellectual connection had been the foundation of their relationship before. "You have a thorough understanding of estate management," he said finally. "Unusual for a companion," she finished with a small smile. "My circumstances have not always been so reduced, Your Grace." "I meant for anyone," he corrected. "My stewards in London could learn from your methods." He rose to examine the map of the estate hanging on the wall, his back to her. "Lady Millicent, may I speak frankly?" Her hand stilled on the ledger. "Of course. Since the ball, I have been troubled. You remind me greatly of someone I once knew, not merely in appearance, but in manner of thought, in certain turns of phrase." Millicent carefully closed the ledger. "The world is full of coincidences, Your Grace. So it would seem." He turned to face her. "Listen, she was lost during the war years. An accident." "I am sorry for your loss," she said softly, meaning it. "The strange thing is," he continued, watching her closely, "when I look at you, I feel as though I am speaking with her, as though somehow, despite all logic and evidence, she stands before me." Millicent rose from her chair, needing to create distance between them. "Grief can play strange tricks on the mind, Your Grace. We see what we wish to see in the faces of strangers. Is that what we are, Lady Millicent? Strangers?" The question hung in the air between them. Millicent moved to the window, looking out at the winter garden, where a lone gardener cleared snow from the paths. "We are what circumstances have made us," she replied carefully. "You are the Duke of Thornfield, soon to make an advantageous marriage. I am your aunt's companion. Our paths crossed briefly, nothing more." She heard him approach, stopping a respectful distance behind her. "When you speak of justice for the tenants," he said quietly, "you quote Seneca's views on clemency. It is a rather obscure text." Millicent's breath caught. It was a text they had read together, in the library at Thornfield Park, during the early days of their marriage. "I had an unusual education," she managed to say. "So it appears." His voice held no accusation, only a deep, searching quality. "Lady Millicent." "Your Grace," she interrupted, turning to face him with newfound resolution. "Your aunt mentioned you would be returning to London tomorrow. I imagine Lady Caroline will be pleased to have your attention returned to the wedding preparations." The shift in topic was abrupt, but effective. His expression closed, becoming once again the polite mask of a nobleman addressing a social inferior. "Yes," he said. "There are matters requiring my attention in London. Then I wish you safe travels." She curtsied. "The accounts will be in order when next you visit Ravenscroft." He studied her face one last time, as though memorizing it, or perhaps comparing it to a memory. Then he bowed. "Until then, Lady Millicent." When the door closed behind him, she pressed her hand against the cold window glass, steadying herself. He was beginning to see too much. The coincidences were mounting. Soon, suspicion would become certainty. She had a choice to make before that moment arrived. A week passed. The Duke returned to London as planned, But Millicent's relief was short-lived. 3 days after his departure, a letter arrived from the capital, addressed to the Countess. Lady Ravenscroft read it during breakfast, her expression growing increasingly troubled. "It seems my nephew's engagement is not proceeding as smoothly as expected," she said, folding the letter. "The Earl of Westmoreland is demanding additional guarantees before the contracts are signed." "What sort of guarantees?" Millicent asked, pouring the Countess's tea. "Political appointments, primarily. The usual currency of such arrangements." The elderly woman sighed. "Alexander writes that he will return to Ravenscroft next week to review some historical documents in the family archives. Apparently, there is precedent for such negotiations in our family's past." Millicent's cup rattled slightly against its saucer. "I see. Shall I prepare the archives for his use?" "Please do. And Millicent," the Countess added, studying her companion shrewdly, "you seemed rather affected by my nephew's presence during his last visit. If you find it uncomfortable to work closely with him, I can assign another to assist." "That won't be necessary," Millicent replied quickly. "I was merely unused to such direct involvement in estate matters. I will serve however I may be useful." The truth was more complicated. During the Duke's absence, Millicent had come to a difficult decision. She could not continue this precarious existence, with discovery constantly threatening. When he returned, she would give notice to the Countess and seek a position elsewhere, perhaps in the north, where connections to her past were fewer. It would mean starting over again. But she had done it before. The alternative, remaining and risking exposure that could damage the Duke's political position, was unthinkable. The Duke arrived on a cold, clear day. Millicent ensured she was occupied with the Countess's correspondence when he was welcomed, avoiding any immediate encounter. But that evening, as she crossed the gallery toward the library, she found him standing before a portrait she had always been careful to avoid. It hung in a dimly lit corner, a woman in a blue gown, painted some 15 years earlier. The resemblance to Millicent was not exact. The woman in the portrait wore her hair differently, her expression more vivacious, her posture more confident, but the eyes were unmistakable. "My cousin Elizabeth," the Duke said without turning. "She married a diplomat and died abroad during the war. You bear a striking resemblance to her." Millicent's heart pounded. This was a test, she realized. Elizabeth had been the cover story they had agreed upon when she first took his name, a distant relation to explain her sudden appearance in society. "A coincidence, Your Grace," she said softly, though a flattering one. She was beautiful. He turned to face her. "She never existed, Lady Millicent." The gallery seemed suddenly airless. "I don't understand." "Elizabeth was a fiction we created," he said quietly. "There was no cousin, no diplomat, only a convenient explanation for introducing a new duchess to society." Millicent took a step back. "Your Grace, I fear you are confusing me with—" "I am not confused," he interrupted, his voice gentle but firm. "Not anymore." She looked at him then, really looked, and saw in his eyes that he knew. The pretense was over. 7 years of careful deception, undone by a fictional cousin whose name she had forgotten. "When?" she asked simply. "I suspected during our first dance. I knew with certainty when you quoted Seneca." He moved closer. Close enough that she could see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes that hadn't been there before. "What I don't know is why." Millicent glanced down the gallery, ensuring they were alone. "This is neither the time nor the place, Alexander." The use of his given name, the first time she had spoken it in 7 years, seemed to affect him deeply. He drew a sharp breath. "Then when? Where?" "You have been legally dead for 7 years, Catherine." Her birth name, spoken aloud, made her flinch. "Tomorrow," she said. "The archives, before breakfast, when the house is still quiet." He studied her face. "You're planning to leave, aren't you?" Her silence was answer enough. "Don't," he said, then caught himself. "At least, not before we've spoken. Your engagement is not yet finalized," he finished. "The archives, tomorrow morning. I will be there at dawn." She nodded once, then continued down the gallery, feeling his gaze follow her until she turned the corner. In her room that night, Millicent, Catherine, packed her few belongings. Whatever happened tomorrow, she could not remain at Ravenscroft. The truth would demand decisions. Neither of them was free to make. She removed the sapphire pendant from its box, and for the first time in 7 years, fastened it around her neck. It lay cool against her skin, a weight both familiar and strange. Tomorrow she would explain why she had disappeared after the carriage accident, why she had allowed him to believe she was dead, why she had chosen a life of obscurity rather than return to her position as his duchess. She would tell him about the scandal that had threatened to destroy his political career, just as England needed stability most, about the choice she had made to protect him by removing herself from the equation, and then she would leave. Because the reasons for her disappearance still existed. His duty to his family name and to England remained unchanged. Some sacrifices, once made, could not be unmade, even when the heart still remembered what it had lost. The archives of Ravenscroft Hall occupied a long room on the ground floor, its walls lined with cabinets containing family records dating back centuries. Dawn light filtered weakly through narrow windows, casting thin rectangles of pale gold across the polished floor. Catherine arrived first, having slept little. She wore her usual gray dress, but had left off the widow's cap, her dark hair arranged in a simple knot at the nape of her neck. The sapphire pendant remained hidden beneath her high collar. She moved among the cabinets with practiced familiarity, selecting several bound volumes and arranging them on the central table. Records of the estate during the war years, correspondence with the Home Office, the official report of the carriage accident that had supposedly claimed her life. The door opened quietly. Alexander entered, closing it carefully behind him. He looked as though he, too, had passed a sleepless night. He said, the name still awkward on his tongue after so many years of believing her gone. I prefer Millicent now, she replied gently. Catherine died in that ravine. He approached the table, noting the documents she had gathered. You've been thorough. I've had access to these archives for 5 years. I know what they contain. He sat across from her, his posture formal, despite the intimacy of the moment. Tell me. She folded her hands on the table. What do you remember of the night before my accident? We argued, he said after a moment, about my appointment to the diplomatic mission to Vienna. You didn't want me to go. That was the surface of it, she agreed. But do you recall why I objected so strongly? Alexander frowned. You feared for my safety. The war was still ongoing. Partially. She opened one of the volumes, turning it toward him. This contains the intelligence reports from that period. Reports suggesting that someone close to the British delegation was passing information to Napoleon's agents. His expression darkened. I remember the rumors. They were investigated and dismissed. They were suppressed, she corrected quietly, because the evidence pointed to your cousin Richard, who was not only part of the delegation, but also brother-in-law to the foreign secretary. Alexander stared at the document before him, then at her. You knew this before the accident. I discovered it, she said, through my brother's connections at the War Office. I confronted Richard privately, hoping to persuade him to withdraw from the delegation without telling me. You were already under tremendous pressure. The coalition against Napoleon was fracturing. Your voice in Vienna was crucial. She hesitated. And Richard made it clear that if I exposed him, he would ensure your reputation was destroyed along with his. He had fabricated evidence implicating you as his co-conspirator. Alexander's face had gone pale. So the accident was arranged by Richard, she confirmed. Though I suspect he meant only to frighten me into silence. The carriage going over the embankment was unplanned. My God, Catherine Millicent. He reached across the table as if to take her hand, then stopped himself. You survived, obviously. Why not come back? Why let me believe you were dead? She met his gaze steadily. Because in that moment I saw a solution. Richard believed he had silenced me permanently. If I remained dead, the threat to your position was removed. You could continue your work without the scandal that would have erupted had I accused a member of your family of treason. So you sacrificed everything, your position, your name, our marriage, to protect my political usefulness. His voice held a mixture of disbelief and dawning comprehension. To protect England's stability, she corrected gently. And yes, to protect you. The work you were doing was too important to be derailed by scandal. Alexander stood abruptly, pacing to the window. Where did you go? How did you survive? My lady's maid helped me. She had family in the north. I lived there quietly for 2 years, then gradually established the identity of Lady Millicent Lockwood. A sad smile touched her lips. A widow is conveniently free of attachments, you see. No one asks too many questions. And then you came to work for my aunt, deliberately. She shook her head. That was coincidence, or perhaps fate. The position was available, and I had the necessary skills. I never intended to cross paths with you again. He turned from the window. Richard died 3 years ago. I know. She met his gaze. But by then I had been dead for 4 years. What would my resurrection have accomplished, except fresh scandal? You were established as a respected voice in government. I had built a new life. It seemed best to leave the past buried. Alexander returned to the table, his expression troubled. You made this decision alone. You gave me no choice. Yes, she admitted. I did what I thought necessary at the time. And now, he asked, now that I know you're alive, that my cousin was a traitor who nearly killed my wife. What would you have me do with this knowledge, Millicent? She closed the volume before her. Nothing. I will leave Ravenscroft today. You will return to London and finalize your engagement to Lady Caroline. The political alliance with her father remains as important now as my disappearance was then. And you? His voice had softened. What becomes of you? I will find another position, perhaps as a governess this time. She attempted a smile. I am still young enough to reinvent myself once more. Alexander was silent for a long moment, studying her face in the strengthening morning light. Then, with deliberate movements, he removed the signet ring that marked him as the Duke of Thornfield. He placed it on the table between them, the heavy gold gleaming against the dark wood. The gesture's significance was unmistakable. The ring was more than jewelry. It was the physical embodiment of his title, his responsibilities, his place in society. Alexander, she whispered, understanding flooding her. You cannot. I lost you once to duty, he said quietly. I will not lose you again to the same master. The alliance with Westmoreland can be achieved through other means. His voice was firm. I have spent 7 years believing you dead, Millicent. 7 years fulfilling every obligation to family and country. I will not spend the rest of my life pretending you remain so. He did not reach for her, did not make grand declarations. Instead, he simply sat across from her, the ring between them, offering a choice rather than imposing one. It will not be simple, she said finally. Few things of value are. Outside, the winter sun had fully risen, casting the room in clear, cold light. Catherine Millicent looked at the man before her, at the ring on the table, at the life it represented. And for the first time in 7 years, she allowed herself to consider a future different from the one she had resigned herself to. Spring came late that year. April found the gardens of Thornfield Park still recovering from winter's grip, with only the hardiest blooms defying the lingering chill. In the east wing of the house, Catherine, now legally restored to her title as Duchess of Thornfield, sat at her writing desk, completing a letter. The past 3 months had unfolded with careful deliberation, rather than dramatic flourish. There had been no public sensation, no society scandal. The Duke had managed the revelation of his wife's survival with the same diplomatic skill he brought to international negotiations. The official explanation was simple and partially true. The Duchess had suffered injuries and memory loss in the accident. She had been cared for by a rural family until her health and memory gradually returned. Upon learning her identity, she had been quietly reunited with her husband. Lady Caroline Harcourt's engagement to the Duke had been amicably dissolved before any formal announcement, with the Earl of Westmoreland instead receiving favorable consideration for a diplomatic appointment he had long coveted. The political alliance remained intact, merely taking a different form. The Countess of Ravenscroft, after her initial shock, had embraced the truth with surprising adaptability. I always thought there was something familiar about you, she told Catherine with a shrewd smile, though I never imagined my companion was actually my niece. Catherine sealed her letter, a monthly correspondence with the Countess that maintained their connection, and moved to the window. Below, in the formal garden, Alexander walked with his steward, discussing improvements to the estate. He had changed since their reunion, the rigid formality softening into something more balanced. He still served in government, still fulfilled his responsibilities to the dukedom, but no longer at the expense of his private happiness. Their life together had resumed with careful tenderness. They were different people now, shaped by 7 years of separation and the choices they had made. The passionate young couple of their first marriage had been replaced by 2 adults who approached their reunion with measured hope and mutual respect. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. "Enter," she called. Mrs. Winters, who had followed Catherine from Ravenscroft Hall, unwilling to part from the mistress she had come to respect, appeared with a silver tray. "A letter from London, Your Grace. And the Duke asks if you will join him in the library when you're available. The solicitor has arrived with the final documents. Thank you, Mrs. Winters. Please tell His Grace I'll be down shortly." When the housekeeper had gone, Catherine opened the letter. It was from her brother, now returned from his own diplomatic service abroad. He wrote of his plans to visit Thornfield Park in the summer, of his relief at her miraculous return, and of political matters that might interest Alexander. She placed the letter in her desk drawer and prepared to join her husband. The documents awaiting her signature would complete the restructuring of the Duke's affairs, a careful redistribution of properties and investments that would secure their future, regardless of any political changes. Never again would duty to the title override all other considerations. In the library, Alexander and the solicitor rose at her entrance. The business was concluded quickly, with Catherine signing her restored name to the final papers. When the solicitor had departed, Alexander came to stand beside her at the window. "Are you satisfied with the arrangements?" he asked. "Yes," she replied. "Though I still think the cottage in Devon is an unnecessary precaution." He smiled slightly. "But I prefer knowing we have options beyond the dukedom, should we ever need them." They stood in companionable silence, watching the gardeners at work below. The easy intimacy between them had been hard won, built through countless quiet conversations and gradual revelations over the past months. "I received a letter from James," she said. "He'll visit this summer." "Good." "I've missed his perspective on the continental situation." Alexander turned to face her. "And you? Do you miss your life as Lady Millicent Lockwood?" It was a question he had never asked before. Catherine considered it carefully. "Sometimes," she admitted. "There was a simplicity to that existence. My responsibilities were clear, my place defined. As a duchess." She gestured to the room around them, with its evidence of wealth and position. "You could have kept your freedom," he said quietly. "That morning in the archives, you could have walked away, as could you." She touched the signet ring, now back on his hand. "But we both chose differently." Alexander nodded, understanding what remained unspoken. They had chosen each other, but also chosen to accept the complexities that came with their positions. The dukedom was not merely a title, but a responsibility to land, tenants, and history. "I have something for you." Reaching into his coat pocket, he withdrew a small box and opened it, revealing a ring set with a sapphire that matched her pendant. "Alexander, not a replacement for your original ring," he explained, "but a marker of our new beginning, if you wish it." Catherine took the box, studying the ring. It was elegant but understated, suitable for a duchess who had learned the value of quiet dignity. "I do wish it," she said softly, allowing him to place it on her finger. Later that afternoon, they walked together through the winter garden, now showing the first signs of awakening. The air was still cool, but the brittle quality of deep winter had yielded to something more forgiving. "What shall we plant here?" Alexander asked, indicating a bare section of earth near the stone wall. Catherine considered the space. "Lavender, I think, and perhaps some hardier roses." "Planning for the future," he observed with a slight smile. "Yes," she met his gaze, "a habit I'm relearning." They continued their circuit of the garden in comfortable silence. No passionate declarations, no dramatic gestures, just the quiet certainty of two people who had found their way back to each other through choice rather than chance. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the awakening garden, Catherine slipped her hand into Alexander's. He squeezed it gently in response, a simple acknowledgement of presence. They were not the same people who had loved each other in youth. Time and separation had changed them both, but perhaps this older, quieter love, built on recognition of each other's true nature, on respect for the choices each had made, was stronger for having been tested. Spring would come fully to Thornfield Park in time, bringing new growth and possibilities. For now, it was enough to stand together in the fading light, watching winter slowly release its hold on the world around them.